Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everyone, depending on whichever part of the world you are. Welcome to the March seminar by the ASB and SEACEN, ASB SEACEN seminars on macro finance and emerging markets. Today is a rather special for me and my fellow host Anela Monroe from the Asia School of Business, because today's presenter is a former colleague from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand and also a friend who is now a young star of our profession, and we are really happy and privileged to have him on such an interesting and important topic. But before we come to David and today's talk, let Anela and I say a few upcoming events about the ASB, what ASB and what the SEACEN are up to. I mean, it's been almost a year since we started this series between the Asia School of Business and the SEACEN Centre, and we are really happy that all of you keep coming to our seminars, and we are really happy to be able to attract wonderful speakers on very important, timely topics, and today is no different at all. Anela, I believe, would like to say a few interesting things, a few things about the brilliant new Master of Central Banking program, which is going to start soon. Anela?
Sure. Thanks, Ozair. So at the Asia School of Business, we're starting a new Master of Central Banking degree program. It's a one-year residential program. It starts in June 2021. We're really excited about the curriculum we've put together. It's integrative. The curriculum is sort of obsessive about central banking and tying all the bits together. It's forward-looking and it's global. Finance is getting so global and these days anyway. So yeah, do look it up on our webpage, the link's there, and let any friends who might be interested know about it. Ozair, do you want to talk about so I might say something about the upcoming, we've got definitely one upcoming on central bank digital currencies in the ASB SEACEN webinar series. And we've got some others coming, but they're not completely confirmed yet. The conversations on central banking webinars, these are ASB webinars mostly with former governors of central banks. The first one in April is digital technology and financial inclusion. That will be a conversation with the former governors of the Central Bank of the Philippines and of the Reserve Bank of India. And in May, we've got green finance and central banks, and we've got the former governor of the Swiss National Bank and board member of the Bundesbank. And you can register for those and find out other events in this series at that link at the bottom of the page. Ozair, you want to talk about upcoming SEACEN events?
Yes, I only put four of them. Four of the upcoming SEACEN online seminars. As you can see, Zhang Liu from the San Francisco Fed, and James Morley from University of Sydney, Susan Olivier from University of Baqaee in New Zealand, and Maurice Schlarich from Poland. And as you can see, the topics we'll be covering are capital flows, inflation, and also debt, kind of the issues that we are trying to pick, or some of the main issues that we've been trying to pick. In terms of SEACEN courses, our courses will be starting in June. For the sake of time, I didn't put them online on the slides here, but you can go to our website to see our upcoming courses. But today's topic, or today's visitor, is David. It is wonderful to have David Baqaee from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA with us. David is a research affiliate with the CEPR and also a faculty research fellow with the NBR. David was previously at the LSE before joining the UCLA, and his research interests include macro network economics, IO, and applied economic theory. David published in some, these insignificant, unimportant journals. Not sure if any of you heard those names, Econometrica, QJE, and he holds a PhD from Harvard as well as an MA. and also BSc in Maths and Econ from University of Canterbury in New Zealand. And today's topic is the supply side effects of monetary policy, joined with a brilliant late Emmanuel Fahri and Kunal Sangani, I believe, who is or is about to finish his PhD at Harvard.
He's actually just started.
Did you say he just started?
Basically, I think Kunal is an excellent, phenomenal second-year student.
Wow. David, thank you very much again. The floor or the camera is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ozer, Anela, and Ole, for inviting me to give this talk today. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I just need some help figuring out how to share my screen because I've forgotten how to do it now. Is there, oh, okay, the prompt came, excellent. Okay, great. So hopefully you can see my screen and you can hear me speak.
Yes, we can, David.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to be here today to talk to you about this paper called The Supply Side Effects of Monetary Policy. It's a joint paper with Emmanuel Fahri, who, as Ozer just mentioned, tragically passed away last year. And it was really a momentous loss for everybody who interacted with him in any capacity, as professionally, intellectually, personally. It's a loss that's really profoundly felt still to this day. And so anything you don't like about the paper, you can blame on me and Kunal, because I'm sure this would be a much better paper if Emmanuel was still around. And of course, Kunal Sangani, who, as Ozer mentioned, is a PhD student at Harvard, who I'm sure you'll hear more about in the future. So in this paper, what we're interested about, or the big picture question that we're interested about, oh, sorry about that, is we're trying to understand whether or not there's a reason to think that shocks to aggregate demand can affect aggregate productivity for an economy. Now, the common view, if you like, or the mainstream view, is that the answer to this question is no. Shocks to aggregate demand are orthogonal to shocks to productivity, to aggregate productivity. Aggregate productivity is understood to be something that's determined by the technological characteristics of the economy, depends on, broadly speaking, how good our technology is. And then on top of that, and it's responsible for long-run growth. And then on top of that, we've got these demand shocks that make things go up and down. Now, if you take this view, if you think that there really is no connection between demand shocks and aggregate productivity, then there is an awkward fact in the data that you have to explain, which is that empirically, measures of productivity at the aggregate level are highly procyclical, and they look like they move in response to monetary disturbances. So, for example, the solo residual looks like it responds to changes in money supply. Labor productivity looks like it responds to fiscal and monetary policy. And so if you think that aggregate productivity has nothing to do with demand, then you have to sort of explain this fact. And a standard explanation is to say that this is all caused by mismeasurement. So for example, maybe we don't quite know how to measure productivity because we don't do correct accounting for input use or capacity utilization. And when you correct for that, then this stuff should all disappear. In this paper, we advance an alternative view, which says that actually demand shocks do affect aggregate productivity, and we should expect them to. This is to say, if you build a model with realistic firm heterogeneity, by which I mean firm heterogeneity that matches what we observe in the microdata, then your model will predict that aggregate productivity is going to be affected by and respond to aggregate demand shocks. And the sort of aggregate demand shock that we're going to focus on today is going to be in the form of monetary shocks. So what do I mean when I say firm heterogeneity is important? Well, if you think about the workhorse New Keynesian model, if you take, for example, Ghali's textbook and you look, or you take Woodford's Mike Woodford's textbook, and you look at the sort of model that represents the workhorse model, what you find is that firms in that model, they compete with each other using monopolistic competition, but every single firm faces a constant and uniform price elasticity of demand. So this is the very tractable and very popular CES specification for preferences. What it means is if you have CES preferences, because every firm faces an isoelastic demand curve, so the price elasticity of demand doesn't vary as the firm gets big or small, then every firm in the economy wants to charge the exact same markup. So in the standard workhorse model, desired markups are uniform and constant across all firms. What this also means is that firms have identical desired responses to shocks. So in the workhorse model, if your marginal cost goes up by 1%, as a firm, your ideal response is to just pass the change in marginal cost into your price and keep your markup constant. Now, the empirical evidence is really at odds with both of these predictions in terms of both the cross-section and the time series. So in the cross-section, it looks like there is a huge amount of heterogeneity in firm-level markups. And this is not dispersion that disappears over time. So there's sort of consistent long-run dispersion in firm-level markups. Not every firm wants to charge the same markup. And furthermore, these markups, the way that they change over time is also related to the size of the firm. So for example, in the data, firms with very high markups partly absorb cost shocks into their markups, whereas firms with low markups, low profit margins, they pass the cost shocks onto their consumers. And this idea, which is called incomplete pass-through, is something that you don't get out of the traditional model. So what we're going to do today is we're going to build, I think, a fairly tractable way of trying to integrate these sorts of firm heterogeneity into a standard New Keynesian model. And what we're going to show is that it's going to deliver very rich predictions for how demand shocks or monetary shocks are going to be transmitted to the real economy. In particular, what we're going to show is that aggregate demand shocks can actually affect the productivity in the economy, and that effect can be quite powerful. Okay, great. So I'll just pause in case there's any questions before I continue. Excellent. So what we do in this paper is we're going to propose a new transmission mechanism for monetary policy, which we're going to call the misallocation channel or the allocative efficiency channel. And what we're going to show is that every time there is a monetary easing, there's going to be an improvement in allocative efficiency in the economy. And this improvement looks like a positive aggregate supply shock, but it's endogenous. And the endogenous aggregate supply shock, what it's going to do is it's going to flatten the Phillips curve relative to a model that doesn't have these features. And it's going to tie the slope of the Phillips curve to the industrial organization of the underlying economy. So things like industrial concentration, for example, are going to matter for thinking about how flat the Phillips curve is. And what we're going to find is that every time there is for example, a monetary contraction, aggregate TFP as measured by the solo residual is going to fall, even though there's no change in technological progress. There's no technical regress, and yet aggregate productivity can go down during recessions. And furthermore, we find that firm-level TFPR dispersion is going to be counter-cyclical, and it's going to rise in recessions and fall in booms. But this fact in the data, which sometimes people try to explain with uncertainty shocks, we can actually get as a natural prediction from this model, which doesn't have any changes in uncertainty in it. Now, the kind of mechanism that I'm going to focus on in this talk today, it's going to apply in other frameworks than the one that I'm going to use. So the findings are going to sort of apply whenever you have variable markups and variable pass-throughs that co-vary with each other. In particular, in today's talk, I'm going to focus on a model with monopolistic competition. But if you're interested in models with oligopolistic competition, for example, like the Atkinson-Bernstein model, in the appendix of the paper, we show that similar results are going to hold for those. The advantages of sticking with monopolistic competition, which is what I'm going to use today, is that it allows us to do dynamics very easily. So I'm going to show you first a simple static model so that we can get intuition for what the main mechanism is. And then I will show you what the dynamic model looks like, which, because we stick to monopolistic competition, is going to be very easy to characterize. If you had oligopoly, then the dynamic model would be much more complicated. There would be a dynamic game that you'd have to solve, and we don't get into that. So what we're going to come up with at the end of the day is going to be a 4-equation New Keynesian model, to contrast with the workhorse 3-equation New Keynesian model that you would find in, chapter 3 of Ghali's textbook. And the 4th equation in this model is going to be an equation that tells you how aggregate productivity is moving endogenously in response to monetary disturbances. And then we're going to estimate all of this non-parametrically and then calibrate it to see what it implies quantitatively. Okay, excellent. So just to set the scene, the model is going to have monopolistic competition, as I mentioned. The key deviation that we're going to have relative to the standard model, though, is we're going to allow for what are called Kimball preferences. And these Kimball preferences are, you can think of them as being more general than the CES preferences that you would find in Ghali's textbook. And on top of this, we're going to allow for heterogeneity on the firm side. So we're going to allow firms to have different marginal costs. Some firms can be very productive. Some firms can be much less productive. So there's variation in the sort of level of productivity of the firms. And then what we're going to find is that therefore firms are going to want to charge different markups, and they're going to have different pass-throughs of marginal cost into their prices. And then on top of this, we're going to have nominal rigidities in the form of Calvo frictions. Excellent. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how output's going to respond to monetary disturbances, and then we're going to break down what determines the slope of the Phillips curve. Very good. I think with due deference to other people who've done lots of important work in the literature, I'm going to skip the related lit. I'm happy to come back and talk about this in detail if there's any questions. But since I've only got an hour, I think I'm just going to go straight to the model and the results. So I'll just pause briefly if there's any questions. Okay, excellent. Okay, so here's the agenda for today. So first, I'm going to set up the static version of the model, which I think is the easiest way to see the mechanism that we're after. And in this simple static model, I'm going to show you how monetary policy is going to be transmitted to both aggregate productivity and to real GDP. And then once we have a good handle on the static model, then I'll show you the dynamic extension, which is this 4-equation New Keynesian model. And then we'll calibrate that model and see quantitatively how important the effects are. Okay, excellent. So here is the timing in the simple, here's the timing in the simple static version of the model. We assume that the economy is in some initial equilibrium. And in the initial equilibrium, firms are setting their prices to maximize profits. Households are maximizing utility, and markets are clearing. Then between period 0 and period 1, the monetary authority chooses a nominal price, or it introduces a nominal shock into the economy. The way we're going to model this is as a change in the nominal wage, which is going to be the sort of input cost in this economy. So this is implicitly, implemented because there's a cash in advance constraint or a money demand or something. The monetary authority just chooses a nominal price. But this happens as like an MIT shock. It's a 0 probability unexpected event. So after this happens, we're going to go to a new equilibrium where some fraction of firms have flexible prices, so they can adjust their price, but some fraction of firms don't adjust their price, and they just stick to what they had in the previous period. Households adjust, and the resource constraints bind. So that's the basic structure of the model. So we have households, we have firms, and we have the monetary authority. So I'm going to describe to you what problem each agent in the model is going to be faced with. So this is the household's problem. So the household is maximizing consumption utility, where big Y here is consumption, but it's also going to be real GDP in this economy. And there's a disutility of labor L with a Frisch elasticity of labor supply, which is given by zeta. Now, crucially, what we're going to assume is that the amount of output that the representative consumer gets is given implicitly by this function here, which is called a Kimball aggregator. Now, what I want you to notice here is that Y omega are like different varieties of goods that the household can consume. And then big Y is the total consumption basket that the household gets. And so this equation here, this equation here implicitly defines big Y in terms of little y. Notice that if this upsilon function was a power function, so if it was just Y omega divided by big Y raised to some power, then you could take Y over to the other side and it would become CES preferences. So this is just a generalization of CES preferences, but it's going to have some very useful properties that are going to be very important. So what I want to emphasize is if you stick to CES preferences, you fail to match the data and you don't see these supply side effects that are in the model. So that's why we're deviating from them. And then the representative household faces a budget constraint that just says you have to finance your consumption expenditures using labor income and profit income that's rebated back from the firms. Okay, very good. So given this household problem, we can look at what the residual demand curve looks like for an individual variety. So if you take some variety omega, so this is the output of some micro level producer, then there's a relationship between relative quantities of omega and the relative price of omega. Notice that if upsilon is a power function, then this is just the residual demand curve that you would get if you had CES preferences. So again, this is showing you the usefulness of these Kimball aggregators, the Kimball preferences, is that it generalizes the CES monopolistic competition in a very natural and clean way. The beauty of Kimball is that we can now pick this upsilon function to make the residual demand curve that a firm faces have any shape that we like, which is going to be key. Because this function in the data does not look isoelastic, basically. And so that's why we want to move away from it. Okay, so on the production side, we have firms that are going to be indexed by their type. So I'm going to index their type by theta, and theta ranges from 0 to 1. I want you to think of 0 as the least productive firms in the economy. And I want you to think of theta equals 1 as the most productive firms in the economy. So every variety is produced by a single producer subject to a Calvin friction who has a type. And then if you are of type theta, then with probability 1 minus delta of theta, you can set your price before observing the nominal shock. So you have sticky prices. And delta theta is the probability you have flexible prices. So this delta here is the Calvin parameter. We're going to allow it to vary by firm type, but it's not necessary that we do this. We just do it so we can see how that's going to affect the results. And then production is going to be linear with the marginal cost of production given by the wage divided by the productivity shifter of firms who are of type theta. And so production is linear and uses labor. So very standard production for a function. So firms are going to set their prices to maximize expected profits. So here's the expected profits of the firms, and they're going to understand, these firms, that they face a downward sloping residual demand curve. And so they're going to set their prices optimally, given the fact that their demand curve is downward sloping. Okay, so in order to understand this model, I'm going to have to define a little bit of notation that's going to be really key going forward. So one piece of notation that I'm going to have to define is the price elasticity of demand, which is given by sigma. So sigma is some function which depends on the size of the firm. So it's different for different firms. And in the Kimball class of preferences, the price elasticity of demand for a firm is just given by the curvature of the upsilon function. So notice this is like the Arrow-Pratt measure of curvature. It's the reciprocal of the Arrow-Pratt measure of curvature. And so if this was a power function, if upsilon was a power function, which is to say it was if it was CES preferences, this thing would just be a constant. It's the thing you would normally call the elasticity of substitution. But in this world, this price elasticity is going to vary as a function of firm size. Because the price elasticity of demand varies as a function of firm size, that means the desired markups are going to vary as a function of firm size. Big firms don't want to charge the same markup as small firms do because their demand curve is not doesn't have the same elasticity. The final piece of information I need to introduce is the marginal cost, which is is the pass-through, is what I meant to say. So the pass-through is if in partial equilibrium your marginal cost goes up by 1%, by how much do you want to change your price? That's called the pass-through. And so the pass-through in this case, whoops, the pass-through in this case is going to be a function rho, and it's going to vary as a function of firm size. So again, to go back to the CES world, in the CES world, desired pass-through is always equal to 1. But in this world, the pass-through is going to vary as a function of firm size. So empirically, we expect this pass-through function to have some properties, which I think is helpful just to write down here. We expect empirically that pass-through should be less than 1 or at least equal to 1. It shouldn't be greater than 1. And we should expect it to decline as a function of firm size. So here are some estimates from a recent paper by Mary Amiti and her co-authors, which basically shows you what pass-throughs they estimate for different firms of different sizes. So as we go across the x-axis here, we're including more and more firms. So when we go to the far end of the x-axis, where x equals 1, this is like we're including all firms of all firm sizes. And when we include all firms, the average pass-through, which is the thing, sales-weighted pass-through, which is the thing that we have on the y-axis, is approximately 0.65. So that means that on average, what they find is that when marginal cost goes up by 1%, the price only goes up by 0.65%. Now, if you look at this function, though, what you see is that for like the bottom 80% of firms in the sample, so for the smallest 80% of firms, this pass-through is very, very close to 1. It's like 0.97. So for most firms, their pass-through is almost complete. But then there's some gigantic firms that have incomplete pass-throughs. And so this is the sort of picture you want to have in mind. Now, in the like Calvo world with CES preferences, this would be a flat line. There wouldn't be this kind of downward sloping shape to it, which is going to be really key for generating the results I'm about to show you. Okay, so that's the structure of the model. So the central bank, as I said, is going to choose a nominal price. We're going to stick with the nominal wage as the thing they choose. And then the equilibrium follows after that choice. So now let's think about how monetary policy is going to affect the economy in this very simple setup. We haven't put in a lot of ingredients. We just made CES a little bit more general so that it can match the data. So in general, when the central bank changes the nominal price, the nominal wage, output in this economy could respond for two different reasons. Either output could change because there's a change in employment, or output could change in principle because there's a change in productivity. And so if you think of this thing, you can either think of it as labor productivity or the solo residual. They're the same thing in this simple model. So we're going to call productivity D log A, big A. Big A represents productivity, aggregate productivity in our economy. And we say, OK, in principle, it could be that either of these is moving. Now, in the standard model, this is the thing that the literature has focused on in the new Keynesian literature, which is the demand side effect. The idea that by doing a monetary easing, there is an increase in labor demand and an increase in employment, and therefore there's an increase in real GDP. And the thing we're going to be focused on in this paper is this other part, changes in productivity. Now, in the literature by and large, this effect is not talked about. And the reason is because in the literature, the standard assumption when you use, for example, CES preferences, is that firms' markups are all the same in the initial equilibrium. And if firms' markups are all the same in the initial equilibrium, then aggregate productivity is not going to change to a first order. So this explains why the productivity effect has been missing from sort of the standard textbook treatment of monetary policy. And what we're going to show you is that when you move away from this assumption that markups are all the same in the initial equilibrium, then suddenly aggregate productivity is going to start moving around. Great. Okay, so now to think about how aggregate productivity is going to move around, I just need to define one more piece of notation, which is the sales shares of firms of different types. So I'm going to call that lambda. And so if you see an expectation with a subscript lambda, you should think of this as a sales weighted average of whatever is inside the square brackets. So these sales weighted averages are going to be the relevant notion that we need to think about. Okay, so now we want to understand how allocative efficiency is going to change in this economy in response to a shock. So I'm going to define the average markup in this economy by mu bar. The average markup is the harmonic average of the underlying firm level markups. Now, in previous work with Emmanuel that I did, we showed that in general, in sort of a very general class of Arrow-Debreu type models, you can understand the movements of aggregate productivity by looking at two statistics in the markup distribution. In particular, what we showed is that changes in aggregate productivity are equal to the difference between the change in the average markup and the average change in the markup. So this might be a little hard to understand stated like this, but the way you should think about this is if this is positive, then what it's telling you is that markup, the average markup has gone up, but markups on average have not gone up. The only way that could happen is if the high markup firms have gotten larger. So if you're in a situation where firms aren't putting up their markups, but the high markup firms are getting larger, then that's going to represent an improvement in allocative efficiency. Now, at first blush, this might be very surprising to you because maybe you think that high markup firms should not be getting larger. Aren't high markups bad? But it's actually quite intuitive because if you think about it for a second and you say to yourself, what is it about a high markup that's bad? You realize what's bad is that the high markup firms are not producing as much as they should be. They're choking off demand on underproducing to raise their profits. That's what a high markup does. So the efficient thing would be somehow to force this firm to produce more. So if something happens that takes resources away from the low markup firms and gives it to the high markup firms, that's going to improve efficiency because that's what a planner would like to do. The planner, if they could choose where the labor goes, would like more of the labor to go to the high markup firm than the low markup firm. So that's going to represent these reallocations. Because the firms don't charge the same markups, these reallocations are going to improve aggregate productivity. So here's how aggregate productivity is going to respond in this model when you shock the nominal wage. There's going to be two components. The first thing I want you to notice is that these kappas over here, they're just some scalars that are positive, so you can ignore them. The key intuition, the thing that's really important, that's going to determine the sign of this thing, whether it's positive or negative, is going to be these covariances. So in particular, there's two covariances that are going to be key. The first covariance is the covariance between firm level pass-throughs and firm level price elasticities. amongst the flexible firms. So if you're in a situation where firms with high pass-throughs have high price elasticities of demand, and firms with low pass-throughs have low price elasticities of demand, then every time you shock monetary policy, you're going to get a change in aggregate productivity. In particular, every time you do a monetary easing, you're going to raise aggregate productivity. These are reallocations that are happening because of heterogeneity and desired pass-through by firms. There's a second mechanism that could play a similar role, which is if you have the price stickiness parameter be correlated with the price elasticity of demand. And in both cases, you're going to get positive reallocations. So this is probably the most important slide conceptually in terms of what's going on here. And I'm just going to pause to give you some intuition about it. So what this equation is saying is if these covariances are positive, then every time the central bank increases, the behavior of the central bank causes marginal cost to go up, the low markup firms who have the low pass-through, what they do is they don't transmit the increase in marginal cost into their price. They eat some of the increase in marginal cost by adjusting their markups. Whereas the low markup firms who don't have high margins, they are just going to pass the cost shock onto their prices and onto their consumers. So what that means is you did a cost shock that caused the high markup firms to not adjust their price by as much as the low markup firms. And what this does is this reallocates resources away from the low markup firms towards the high markup firms who are too small. And that's going to boost aggregate productivity. Okay, so the thing that's really key, the thing that's sort of at the heart of this mechanism is the idea that there is a covariance between the initial level of the markup and the realized pass-through of marginal cost into the price. And whenever these two things are covarying systematically, a monetary disturbance, or I think actually any kind of aggregate demand shock, is going to have effects on the solo residual. It's going to have effects on productivity. In particular, if the data satisfies this condition that I said is very natural, which is that the big firms have low pass-throughs and the small firms have high pass-throughs, then the sign of this is always going to be positive, which is to say a monetary easing is always going to raise aggregate productivity. And a side consequence of this also is that dispersion in firm level TFPR, if productivity is pro-cyclical, then dispersion in firm level TFPR is going to be counter-cyclical. So that means every time there's a monetary easing, the markup distribution is going to shrink in terms of its dispersion. Because remember, the high markup guys are adjusting their markup. And so they're cutting their markups. And so because they're at the high end and they're cutting their markups, that's going to shrink dispersion in markups, which means you're getting closer to the Pareto efficient frontier on the PPF. And both of these are things that people find in the data, as I mentioned earlier. Firm level TFPR dispersion looks like it's counter-cyclical. Aggregate productivity looks like it's pro-cyclical. Okay, very good. So, and now, so far we've been talking about aggregate TFP. What about real GDP? How is real GDP responding to shocks in this economy? Well, here's the response of real GDP, and we can break it up into two pieces. The so-called demand side effect, which is where the rest of the literature has been spending its attention on, and then the supply side effect, which is this new effect from changes in aggregate productivity. So what's the demand side effect? The demand side effect is the usual way the new Keynesian model works. Every time the central bank raises the marginal cost, the nominal marginal cost, there's some fraction of firms who are going to cut their markups. Because they cut their markups, so the level of markups goes down, what that does is that boosts labor demand. And because you boost labor demand, you boost employment, that boosts output. That's this effect over here. And it depends on the average cut in the markup. And it also depends on the Frisch elasticity of labor supply. So if the Frisch elasticity is equal to 0, if labor supply is inelastic, then there is no demand side effect, which is something we all intuitively understand. If labor supply is inelastic in the new Keynesian model, monetary policy shouldn't do anything. In this model, that's not true. Even if the labor supply elasticity is 0, there's still this effect, which is non-zero, even when the Frisch is equal to 0, because the central bank can still affect aggregate productivity, even though it can't affect employment. So this demand side effect, which depends on the average reduction in markups, has two components. One is just the sticky price component, which is very intuitive. If you raise costs, some firms have sticky prices. They can't adjust their price. That means their markup is being cut. So the stickier are the prices, the bigger is that effect. That's this mechanism. Then there's a second mechanism in this model, which is the real rigidities effect. This has to do with strategic complementarities and pricing. So if the sticky guys have had their markups cut, then everyone else who doesn't have a sticky price may choose not to adjust their price by as much because the other guys aren't adjusting their prices. So that's the real rigidity channel that people have also focused on a lot in the literature, and you can see it here. If pass-through is equal to 1, it disappears. So both of these effects, though, they work by stimulating labor demand. They don't work by affecting productivity, which is what we're focused on here, and is this independent force that we're isolating. Now, you can put these equations together to create Phillips curves, simple Phillips curves in this sort of two-period model. So here is the wage Phillips curve, and here is the price Phillips curve. And in both cases, what you see is that in the denominator, you have this supply side effects. And whenever these supply side effects are positive, you're going to get a flattening in the Phillips curve, both the wage one and the price one. OK, very good. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, so now that we have a sense of sort of the basic static model, if there's no questions, I'm going to move on to the 4-equation New Keynesian model that generalizes this to a dynamic setup. So I'll just give a couple of minutes in case there's a question. OK, excellent. So how do we take this model and make it dynamic? So what we're going to do is we're going to assume that every firm is setting its price to maximize profit subject to a Calvo friction. And this is now a dynamic forward-looking problem. There's going to be a standard consumption Euler equation for the household that determines the household's intertemporal choices. And the central bank is going to implement policy now in a more traditional way that is probably more familiar, either by setting an interest rate rule, like a Taylor rule for nominal interest rate, or some kind of money supply growth rule. And for the purposes of the talk today, I'm going to further assume that the Calvo parameter is the same for all firms, because that's not the source of variation that we're focused on. We're going to be focused on variation in desired pass-through, not variation in price stickiness. So here is the 4-equation New Keynesian model. So the first 2 equations should be relatively familiar if you're used to looking at New Keynesian models. The first equation is just the Taylor rule, and the second equation is just the Euler equation, or the dynamic IS equation. And these are exactly as in Ghali's textbook, if you like, or Mike Woodford's textbook. The new equations are the New Keynesian Phillips curve, which is now different, and a 4th equation that doesn't appear in the standard treatment. So how is the New Keynesian Phillips curve different? Well, the first difference is what you should notice. The stuff that's different, the first one is that now the Phillips curve is flatter because of incomplete pass-through. So the coefficient, when you look at how inflation is responding to contemporaneous changes in real GDP, the coefficient is now smaller. The other thing that's important is now there is an extra forcing term, like something that looks like a cost push shock inside the Phillips curve, which has to do with changes in aggregate productivity or changes in the solo residual. And The fourth equation is the equation that tells you how this endogenous object, which is the solar residual, is going to respond dynamically. Now, as sort of like a little nerdy detail, if you like, these three equations are all first order difference equations, but this one is a second order difference equation. And what that means is it's sort of naturally going to be a mechanism that generates hump-shaped impulse responses. So that's useful because in the data, impulse response functions often have a hump-shaped look to them.
So can I just ask a clarifying question, David? So you said the last one is a second order difference equation. So the New Keynesian Phillips curve, I'm sort of thinking that in the simpler case, to get to that, it's sort of pages of algebra and kind of complicated. And you've got a whole bunch of other stuff. So I'm thinking this is, 10 times the amount of algebra to get to that. And is it because that, so why is this last one a second order and the others not second order, or are they only first order equations to begin with? Or do you understand what I mean?
Sure.
Or is it that you choose to take the second order approximation, or that they're...
Yeah, no, so everything here is still a first order approximation. It's just that the way aggregate TFP is responding depends on movements in the price level. Whereas inflation, if you like to think about it, like inflation is sort of like the derivative of the price level. So if inflation is first order, like this one is, movements in the price level are naturally going to be second order. And changes in aggregate productivity are going to depend on changes in the price level, because that's the thing that determines, as guys are setting their prices, they're thinking about how the future price level is going to look when they want to decide what sort of price they want to set today. They're not thinking about necessarily what just future inflation is going to look like. And so for that reason, because this is sort of like, these things, the evolution of aggregate productivity depends on movements in the level of prices as opposed to just the inflation rate. That's why you get sort of this second order, by which I mean like an extra term, basically. It's like t plus 1 and t minus 1 instead of just like a t plus 1. But everything is still like a first order Taylor expansion, in the sense that this is all still like a log linearization. I haven't gone second order in that sense. But you're right, Anela, in predicting that there is a lot of algebra to get like clean equations. But the beauty of it is, once the algebra has been done, at this point, this is something you could stick into Dynair without really having to do a lot of work. Because this is just another equation with a bunch of coefficients in front of it. That's very easy to code up and simulate if somebody wanted to do that. Now, there's a bunch of coefficients here that I'm not telling you what they are, like kappa A here. Maybe you're wondering, well, what's kappa A? What's alpha? These are just like functions of some underlying sufficient statistics, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Like, what actually would you need from the data in order to stick this into Dynair and simulate it?
David, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Apologies. In this trend inflation literature, this is more what is not in your model. This trend inflation literature, argues nice that, look, we have non-zero steady state inflation.
Yeah.
Here, when I look at your third equation, I guess it is probably pushing, if I want to link that productivity term maybe to trend inflation, or I guess what I'm saying is that trend inflation literature, they are not putting forward a theory why we've got that, what drives that. We think it's monetary policy kind of thing, whereas prices and productivity are probably related. Mm-hmm. I wonder if there is something there.
Yeah, so in this setup, the sort of fluctuations in productivity. So okay, so just as a technical matter, we've log linearized the model around the zero inflation steady state. So and the model is very sort of, it follows the natural rate hypothesis in the sense that these fluctuations are short run fluctuations of aggregate productivity around whatever the trend is. So this is not a theory that's going to tell you that you can have like sustained growth in productivity through monetary action. For one thing, I mean, like, you know, there is a frontier, and at some point you would hit the frontier. So you can't, it's not like got to give you growth forever. But I think it would be very interesting, and it's something we haven't done right now, to think about what would happen if you were in an economy that when you perform the log linearization, there was already some steady state dispersion just coming from the price rigidity, from the Calvo friction itself. Because here, where the point at which we log linearize the model is a point in which there's no inflation, and the only dispersion in markups is due to desired dispersion in markups, because firms have different desired markups. But like, you might think that in practice, the point you should be looking at is a point where some people have already moved away from their desired markup because of the Calvo friction, and maybe because there's trend inflation. But we haven't done that yet. It's something interesting that we should do, though. So,
yeah. Thank you, David. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. So if you wanted to simulate a model like this, what would you need? So what you need, first of all, is the same parameters that you would need to if you want to ever simulate a new Keynesian model. So you need things like the Frisch, the Calvo parameter, etc. But on top of that, you need 4 new pieces of information. These are like these kappas, they're sort of hiding, and the alpha, they're hiding these 4 pieces of information that you need. What are they? The first one is the average sales weighted pass-through, desired pass-through. And so this is a number that we should think is like maybe like 0.65 or something along those lines. That's what the estimates from Amiti et al. Tell us. The other thing you need is the expected, average markup in your economy. And so this probably is something on the order of 15 to 20%. Maybe it's lower, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 10%, it's somewhere around there. The other thing you need is the average price elasticity of demand. Now, if you think about whenever you calibrate a CES model, you're picking a number as the price elasticity of demand. That's the CES parameter. Well, here it's varying depending on how big the firm is, and you need to know what the average number is. And the last thing you need, which is really key, is the covariance between pass-throughs and price elasticities, or alternatively, the covariance between pass-throughs and the initial markup. Because remember, the price elasticity and the markup are sort of opposites of each other. One is almost like one over the other one. Now, what we're going to do, and I'm going to go through this very briefly because it's not something we do in this paper. In a different paper, we show how from firm level data, you can back out the shape of the Kimball aggregator that rationalizes the data by solving a differential equation. You don't need to worry about that too much. So we do that in order to calibrate our model. In particular, we're not going to use an off-the-shelf functional form like Kleene-Willis preferences. If you're used to working with Kimball, we're gonna derive the Kimball aggregator that can exactly rationalize the data. That means it doesn't have a closed form parametric functional form, but we can still do it. So, you know, I don't have that much time, so I'm not going to get into it, but we solve a differential equation with a boundary condition that gives us the markup function of the economy. And once we have the markup function of the economy, we can pair it with the pass-through function from the Amiti et al. Stuff and calculate all the sufficient statistics we need. For these quantitative results I'm about to show you, we're going to set the average markup to be 15%, which I think is reasonable. And that's the boundary condition that we need for this differential equation. And we are going to set the Calvo parameter to be 0.5. So you should think every period in this case is like half a year or something along those lines. So here, when we solve the differential equation, is the markup function that's implied by the pass-through data that I showed you earlier. And it basically says when you plot markups against firm like quantities and logs, most firms look like they're almost perfectly competitive. And then there's some gigantic firms at the very, very top of the distribution. And these guys have higher markups, and their markups are on the order of like 2.5 or something like that, which is reasonable. It matches what people like DeLocher and so on estimate in firm level data for big firms when they estimate their markups. Here, this is just coming from the differential equation when we solve it and the pass-through function. We don't actually use anything, any markup data. Okay, great. So here we take these and we calibrate the model. So here's the simple static model. First, I'll show you the static model, then I'll show you the dynamic model. So on the left, we have the wage Phillips curve. On the right, we have the CPI Phillips curve. So we're plotting how the slope of the Phillips curve changes for different values of the frish for different versions of the model. So the green model is the Baqaee model, like it's a simple CES model with no real rigidities. There's no supply side effects. You can see that it has the steepest Phillips curve. That means monetary policy is the weakest. You also see as you increase the supply, the elasticity of labor supply, the Phillips curve becomes flatter, which is intuitive. And as the labor supply becomes inelastic, the Phillips curve actually tends towards becoming completely vertical. So the slope goes off to infinity. The real rigidities channel, what you can see is it makes the Phillips curve flatter everywhere. This is strategic complementarities and pricing. It's going to make the Phillips curve flatter, but it still has this feature that if labor supply is inelastic, you get a vertical Phillips curve because you can't affect output at that point with monetary policy. The blue is the model with the misallocation channel included, and what you see is that it gives you a much flatter Phillips curve, and it's actually much more powerful in the part of the parameter space, which I think the empirical literature says we should be focusing on, which is a case where the frish elasticity of labor supply is quite low, like about 0.2. In particular, the blue line, even in the limit when the frish is 0, it still has a finite slope for the Phillips curve. It's going to hit the axes at some finite number. Here's the impulse responses from the dynamic model. So here is we're implementing it with a money growth rule, and you can see what happens in response to a monetary easing, again, for the 3 different types of models. The green one is the standard Baqaee Chapter 3 CES model. The orange one is Baqaee plus real rigidities, which is to say strategic complementarities and pricing. And then the blue is the model with the supply side effect included. And what you can see is that the supply side effect makes monetary policy much more powerful, and it makes it much more persistent over time. It takes a lot longer for the effect to disappear. And here we have changes in the solo residual. We see the green and the orange line are on top of each other. There's no movement in the solo residual in the basic model. In this model, the solo residual is pro-cyclical. It rises and then it falls in response to a monetary easing. And the same thing is happening in dispersion in the cross-section of firms in their TFPRs. Firm TFPR dispersion is counter-cyclical. It falls and then it goes back to normal. So this is what I was saying about, this is not about long-run growth. This is about short-run things that affect output. Here, what we're doing is I'm just plotting the output effect again so you could see it better. So the green is the standard, the yellow is the real rigidities, the blue is the supply side effect included. And what you can see here on the bottom table is I've included the half-life of a monetary shock in each case. So in the CES model, the shock takes approximately 3 periods to die out. The real rigidities mechanism increases the half-life by about 1 period. And the the benchmark model, which has the supply side effects in it, increases the half-life again by 1 period. So it's approximately, these supply side effects are approximately as powerful as real rigidities and strategic complementarities and pricing are in terms of how powerful monetary policy can be. And on the right column, what we're doing is we're looking at basically, this is the Alvarez and Lippi type statistic, which they advance as like an all-encompassing statistic for monetary non-neutrality. What they basically say is when you generate your impulse response from a monetary shock, the way you should measure monetary non-neutrality is by just like coloring in the area under the curve and looking at that area for the whole curve, not just on impact. And if we do that, what we see is the real rigidities increase monetary non-neutrality by about 2.2 log points, and the benchmark model, which includes a supply side effect, again increases monetary neutrality by about a similar magnitude. So as I was saying, these effects really are as powerful as the real rigidities are. Okay, so I'm basically out of time, so I'm not going to take too much more of your time. I'm just going to mention some extensions in the paper that you can take a look at if you're interested. One thing we show in the paper is that increasing industrial concentration in this kind of environment is going to result in a flattening of the Phillips curve. And the reason that happens is because it makes the supply side effects more powerful. In the paper, we also show you how you can take this model and put it into a bigger model. Like if you want to have a model with multiple sectors, multiple factors, input-output linkages, sticky wages, you can do all of that with these ingredients and these kinds of heterogeneities that I've emphasized. And the final thing is, as I alluded to in the paper, you could do all of this with Atkinson-Bernstein and oligopolistic competition if you don't like monopolistic competition with Kimball. The key is you have to get the same sufficient statistics, which is that the level of markups co-varies with the level of pass-throughs. And if you get that sufficient statistic correct, you're going to find quantitatively very similar results. Okay, so I'm out of time, so I'm going to wrap up. So hopefully in this, some of the things that I hope you will walk away with after this talk are when you have an economy that has some initial distortions in place, like heterogeneity in markups, then there's very good reasons to expect that monetary policy should be able to affect allocative efficiency in your economy or aggregate productivity by reallocating resources across firms. And what we show in this paper is that this misallocation channel is very powerful if pass-throughs co-vary with markups in a systematic way. And this is a systematic way that we think is natural, and it's something that people have found in the data when they try to estimate these pass-throughs. And what this does is it flattens the Phillips curve, it increases the persistence of monetary policy shocks, and it imparts hump-shaped responses to variables. And what we'd like to do and what we're working on now is to try to extend this logic to other kinds of demand shocks, because I don't think there's anything specific to monetary policy per se. Other kinds of demand shocks like exchange rate shocks or government spending shocks, I think would behave similarly. And also what we're trying to do is understand the implications of all of this for the conduct of optimal monetary policy, which is something that we left off the table for the paper today. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. The question I was going to ask you was about optimal monetary policy. What does this mean for optimal monetary policy? Maybe that you are a little bit less aggressive, both in terms of your response, would it be to output or inflation, and also a little bit more gradual because you have persistent effects. Is that kind of what your intuition is about that?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly my intuition with one big caveat. So when you want to think about optimal monetary policy, I think one thing you have to ask is like, what exactly is the objective of the policymaker? So if you say the objective is just to minimize fluctuations in output and inflation, as it would be in the sort of standard model, then I think you're exactly right. This sort of just looks like a model where you have a flatter Phillips curve and it's more, things are more persistent. And so whatever intuitions you would have about, the standard model, if you just made prices more sticky, basically, would carry over, I imagine. The thing though that's sort of a little bit more tantalizing in this case is that the standard, the usual justification for that objective, that policy objective of minimizing volatility in output and inflation, it comes from like solving a planning problem for the household, right? That like you'd say to a second order, the social welfare function looks like you would want to minimize these things. But this economy actually is not going to have a social welfare function that looks like that, because the economy starts off at an inefficient point. And so you have sort of a distorted steady state. And so you're stabilizing output around its like normal value is not going to get you, that's not like that's not the optimal level of output because of these distortions in the cross section of markups. And so that's the thing that we're hoping to get our head around. And the truth is, I don't know
So
what
do you
happens.
think would it also potentially create an asymmetry that when you're cutting interest rates, you're increasing TFP, so when you're raising interest rates, you're worsening TFP, so
Yeah,
then
no, it
yeah.
absolutely is going to do that, because what happens is, you know, as you like move the economy towards the frontier, these TFP effects are going to get weaker and weaker, because like once you hit the frontier, the TFP no longer is going to respond to reallocation, because once resources have been efficiently allocated, shuffling things around doesn't do anything to a first order, right? Whereas if you go the other direction, if you make things worse, you're like as you move away from the frontier, this stuff gets stronger. So there is a natural asymmetry in this model, which is that you should expect negative shocks to like do more damage than positive shocks. But we can't actually like say anything about that formally using the formulas I've been showing you, because they're all first order approximations. But for sure, that's a force that's in there that we should understand. That's really helpful. So thanks for that comment.
So I'll go ahead, Ozair.
No, you go ahead, Anila.
So I was just going to say, I've forgotten my question now. Go ahead, Ozair.
Sorry, David, there are a few questions. One of them is from the audience. One of them is one of our participants is referring to some, I think, some post-Keynesian literature which talked about these kind of things, but I will send you that thing in an email. And one question is there anything here or extensions you are thinking of that could help us to understand the apparent flattening of the Phillips curve? And I wonder if that is related to this recent literature on the rise in firm power, or the power of large firms. If you could say anything on that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly an instinct that we had. So this is sort of relates to this point, which is increasing concentration is gonna flatten the Phillips curve, and a flatter Phillips curve can explain the missing inflation or missing disinflation, depending on which way you look at it. Right? Because if the Phillips curve is really flat, your inflation's not gonna move. So that was also something that we thought about, and it turns out that that effect is there. So for example, if you take a measure of industrial concentration, let's say you take the Gini coefficient of the firm employment distribution in the US, and you look at how it's changed over time, what you find is that it's been going up. And so you can calibrate to that increase in the Gini coefficient and see, okay, how much does this flatten the Phillips curve? And what we found when we did things like that is that that effect is there, and it does flatten the Phillips curve by something on the order of 15 to 20%, but it's not like super powerful, it looks like. So I think that it's very plausible that this is a mechanism that can explain part of that. I don't know if I would go so far as to say this is all the explanation. Probably things to do with the way inflation expectations have changed or have become anchored. That's also quite important, I think. The other thing is actually there's quite a bit of controversy about whether or not concentration has been increasing or not, because some recent work has shown that like by Esteban Rossi-Hansberg and Chang Tai-Sheh and people like that, that if you, when you do these measures of concentration, if you focus on local product markets instead of doing it at the aggregate level, oftentimes you find that concentration has been going down. And so the reason is because, like, you know, if you have like big stores that are now available in more locations, at the national level, it looks like concentration is going up. But at the local level, the fact that these big stores have shown up in markets that they previously didn't exist means that market concentration has gone down, because maybe you used to just have two local like mom and pop stores, and now there's a Walmart. So in some sense, concentration in those markets has actually gone down. So there's quite a bit of controversy about whether or not concentration is going up or down. And so that's why we sort of didn't pursue that angle. Yeah.
On exchange rate, I mean, you said at the very beginning, this is, incomplete pass-through is important in this. I mean, incomplete pass-through coming from exchange rate changes is something we also know. I mean, I know you don't have that, but do you think there might be something there coming from the exchange rate channel that might be creating the kind of effect that you are talking about?
Yeah, I think it's very natural to actually think that exchange rate shocks would do things that are quite similar. And I think actually just like any shock that sort of moves costs for firms, moves costs for all firms at the same time, is going to have effects like this, in the sense that it's going to cause firms to differentially change their markups. And as soon as they start differentially changing their markups, you're going to get some reallocations. And because the economy is so far from the Pareto efficient frontier, these reallocations are a big deal. And aggregate productivity is going to move around in response to that. But it's something that we should work on to try to understand better. I mean, I think in that case, the good thing is with exchange rate shocks, there's better hope of identification so that you can sort of go to the data and try to empirically look for these things.
I have one final question, which is from a former student of Miles Kimball himself from Michigan. It's a simple one. You are relaxing the demand side. How about relaxing constant returns to scale? Do you think that might do something?
So that's a great question. So if you relax constant returns to scale, in the standard setup, relaxing constant returns to scale sort of is a form of real rigidities. So if you do decreasing returns, in this model, it's really key here that you have heterogeneity in desired markups and desired pass-throughs, especially in the level of markups, right? So if I go back to this original lemma, this one, if all the firms are charging the same markup, then you're never going to see these sorts of effects, regardless of what you do on the production side of your economy. So you really do need something that causes the firms to start pricing differentially because they have these different markups. And once you have that in place, then it's possible. I mean, I imagine that if you put decreasing returns to scale here, actually I shouldn't speculate because I don't know. I haven't solved that version of the model, but it's very interesting. So it's something that hopefully I'll be able to give a better answer to in a few weeks.
David, that's all from me and our audience. Thank you, Anila.
I have a question.
Do we finish at 12 or 12:30, Ozer? Are we over time?
We usually have an hour, Anila, for these, but we are well over time, and it's getting also late for David. Probably it's evening, but
yeah. Okay, I have plenty more questions for you, David, but I think it's probably a good time to wrap up. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to you, David, and yeah, it's really lovely to see a theory paper that we know how much algebra, and you've really distilled it into that now 4-equation model to make it manageable for people, which is really, really lovely. Yeah, I also want to thank our panelists. It's lovely to have a presentation, but it's not the same if there's nobody to listen to it. And we had lots of people in today, which was great. And also just a thanks to the people behind the scenes, Ash, Vivian, Farah, Hamid, who set it all up and make it happen for us. Yeah, so thanks again, David. Really interesting work, and yeah, changes how we think about the world. So that's good.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you, David. Take care. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Good to see you.
Thank you.